Welcome to Season 2 of WitchLit, a space to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. My guest today, Heather Greene, is a freelance writer, journalist, and editor. She received a BA in film at Wesleyan University and an MA in film studies from Emory University. She also studied film and theater at Cornell and the University of Paris. She is the author of Lights, Camera, Witchcraft, and has written for Religious News Service, Turner Classic Movies, The Wild Hunt, Circle Magazine, Pathos.com, and other outlets. She is a member of Circle Sanctuary, Covenant of the Goddess, and the Religion Newswriters Association. Heather Greene, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show. And I'm glad that we have lots of things to talk about, from writing and film and all kinds of good stuff. So our first question for everybody, though, is why write?
Why write? Well, that's a great question. And I think everybody's answer will be different. But, you know, for me, it's just, I write in my head. I'll be honest. Usually if you see me sitting somewhere, I'm probably writing in my head. And I've heard other writers say that too. So there's always ideas and language just in my head. So the actual act of writing is getting things out, like artists, you know, getting your ideas on page. And it's so satisfying. It really is your, for me, it's my art.
Mm-hmm. So what has your writing journey been like? Like, when did you start writing?
It wasn't a particular moment. I wasn't obviously a writing major or anything like that, but it was sometime I did do some journalism, and, you know, while I was a kid at different kid-oriented papers of high school, et cetera. But it wasn't really a passion of mine then. And it really wasn't until I got to college and I was in film school, and I realized that I enjoyed thinking about movies and writing about movies more than I wanted to make movies, even though the program I was in was geared towards people that were eventually going to go to Hollywood and be directors and producers. So, you know, there's a big joke. You go into film school wanting to be a director, and everybody comes out wanting to be a producer. Well, I came out wanting to be a film historian and a professor and writing about films in some capacity. So that's when I realized that writing was a love. Mm-hmm. And then it just continued from there into grad school and then beyond as a freelancer.
So like in your bio, you talked about writing for these different locations. And I know that you were very involved in the Wild Hunt. You were at one point the managing editor, correct, at the Wild Hunt?
Yes, that's correct. I was with the Wild Hunt for 6 years, and most of which I was the managing editor. And I retired, handed it over in 2018. Mm-hmm. But yeah, a good portion of 6 years, daily writing, for news for the pagan community, and sometimes, and editing. So it was a great time. Mm-hmm. Very informative and fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's in my daily morning inbox. So I appreciate the work that they do at the Wild Hunt, or that you also did at the Wild Hunt. So how did you kind of go from like, I want to write about movies to I'm going to transition to writing about news, and specifically like religious and witchy news? Like, what did that look like?
That's interesting. Things just kind of fall together, you know. Basically, I got my start, my career start, in publicity, PR, and advertising. And so in that capacity, I was also writing. I learned how to write press releases, which are very much news-based. They're same sort of style of writing. And it kind of picked up on something I had done in high school. Like I had said, I'd done some newspaper stuff in high school. And so it kind of picked up on that. And I definitely am a nonfiction writer. So it all kind of was coming together. And other stuff I did freelance stuff was more copywriting. So I wasn't doing like, movie reviews. I wasn't doing those other types of nonfiction academic writing. I was kind of cycling around journalism, and I was again doing PR stuff, which definitely fits into that. And then at some point, I got involved in Covenant of the Goddess and Circle Sanctuary, and they wanted me to do more media stuff for them, news-based related writing. Of course, I started writing news stuff for Lady Liberty League and Covenant of the Goddess as well later. And it sort of steamrolled into doing more news pieces, doing freelance news, and the Wild Hunt and all that stuff. Just kind of flowed in that direction nicely.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that having that exposure to like kind of writing about news in that way and also being an editor, did that impact like the other types of writing you were doing, like work on this book and other things like that? What impact, I guess, more succinctly, did being an editor have on your writing?
You learn from every person you edit. You learn from every person you edit, whether it's factual stuff, the way they write, the styles, you pick on different uses of language. So it sort of stretches your writing muscles. Editing stretches your writing muscles as much as writing different types of genres. And I was just telling some young writers about that. Writing in different genres and different capacities, whether it's a Twitter post or a long format essay or a fiction novel, the more different styles you try, the more you stretch your writing muscles. And I think that goes for editing too, because you're learning other people's styles and what you like and what you don't like. And, oh, that person did that. And I kind of like that. And I want to try that on. So it's definitely, in that capacity, helped my own writing. It definitely corrected some of writing problems I had. And I'm like seeing it in other people and going, why is that? Why are they doing that? And then I realize it's wrong there. And then I realize I'm doing it too. So it kind of helps you correct, grow, and change as a writer, which is a really good thing. You don't want to get stuck. So editing is a really good way of becoming a better writer in many ways, and a better person too, because you get to work with writers and learn. And I enjoy that.
Yeah. So for Lights, Camera, Witchcraft, having read it, feels like a very academic, like it was probably written originally for academic audience, was my take away from it. So what did getting that published look like, and what's the journey of that manuscript?
Well, originally, the concept was going to be something I was going to pursue if I had done a PhD, which I wound up not doing. And it was modeled after my master's thesis, which did a similar type of study, but for in a much smaller group of a much smaller module. It was for Disney princesses and animation. So the model I used was the same, the study model. So it does have academic roots, and certainly I pull from my my film studies work in grad school to create it. However, I never intended this book to be strictly for academic audiences at all. I wanted to write it with the academic rigor and importance that would bring to it. Definitely pulling from my knowledge and experience in that, but I wanted to write it with a tone, a fluidity, and that would be accessible to anyone who loved films, who loves witches, modern real witches or fictional witches, whatever the case may be. I wanted it to be very readable and usable. So it kind of walks the line ultimately in my view. And that's what I've been told as well, because a lot of people who love it, most of the people who I speak to who love the book so far are not academics at all.
Yeah, no, it's a much easier read than academic writing.
I'm glad for that.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't require having to machete your way through some language to get to the part you get. No, and it's such an interesting, I mean, it's just that history. I think the thing that reminded me, like the academic piece of it, was that you were so clear of your parameters in the offset that this is just going to be about film and television. This is going to be about specifically American film and television. And these are my parameters for what counts as a witch movie. So that, I think that part of it was like, oh yes, this has got academic bones kind of thing. So
absolutely. And it does, because like, as I said, it came out of the work I did in master's. And in fact, it was going to be a PhD. If I had continued on, it was going to be my PhD, my dissertation. That was my presentation proposal. So yes, it definitely has academic bones. And I wanted it to be, like I said, I wanted it to be like that. I wanted it to have that kind of level of rigor because it's an important topic and it needed a study like this. And so, yeah, you picked up on that. It definitely has those bones, like you said. I like that.
So the thing that I find interesting about it too is that I think, at least in reading, like it feels like it is probably a different book than if it had been written by someone who wasn't also involved in modern neo-religions. I'm not sure exactly what label you like to use. I don't want to say a witch or, whatever, but I think it, like there's a sensibility to it that feels a little different than if someone who is just looking at this from the outside academically would have. Like, I think there's like, the word is almost like a warmth about it because of being familiar with like the impact of these images on other cultural things outside of film. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for noticing that. And which is fine. I do use that title, and I think that's an important aspect of this, which you've picked up on, obviously, and it's an underlying feature of the book in that way, because people who are witches can look at a witchcraft movie and determine whether the ritual that they're seeing in the movie is something that they've done, something that is true, something that's practiced, or if it's something that was made up. And so you can look at, for example, I Married a Witch from 1942 and see the spellcraft she's doing as something that was imagined from whatever source that they were using. Whereas you can look at a movie like Mark of the Witch, the horror movie from 1972, and go, oh my goodness, I recognize some of the language they're using. I've done that. Even though the ritual is not completely accurate or for its intentions, and it's obviously not a very good portrayal of modern witches, the language is there. It's stuff that they pulled from books. And you can see that and a person who is just looking at these movies from an academic perspective from outside wouldn't necessarily see that or pick up on the nuances that in the relationship that we have as a culture and as a population, a witchcraft population with those images as well. So it is a feature. And yeah, you picked up on that. Thank you.
I also was imagining like the research for this must have been just amazingly extensive because there's so many references to work about films and then about witchcraft, the history of witchcraft and other like cultural aspects that touch on that. But also you just had to have spent a lot of time in front of a screen watching too. So what did the research for the book look like?
Hours in front of the screen. Yes, absolutely. The primary sources. That's the wonderful thing about film and television is most of them are still available, and those are your primary sources. And that's one of the things that, you learn in film school is that, your primary text is going to be analysis of the piece of art is going to be the film or television show. So yes, hours in front of the television or screen, as it were. And then, I got to spend a lot of time in the archives, the Academy's archives, which, as a history nerd, I absolutely loved it. I could have spent weeks there just looking at documents. And they have a lot of the old actual production files, the literal original pieces of paper, as well as books and resources. So that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. And I got to go to LA, so I can't complain. And then of course just tons of archival research, calling libraries, the hardest part was trying to find copies of the silent films. A lot of them are gone, damaged, or there's pieces. So I had a lot of help, wonderful archivists who were really helpful in tracking stuff down for me, tracking documents down for me. And so it was a lot of research. I have several 3-ring binders filled with papers, and I've got files on my computer and files in a drawer. So yes, it was a lot of research, but enjoyable. The whole journey was enjoyable.
Yeah, I was really struck by, I guess, kind of the irony a little bit of like how much of those early silent films we lost, but yet all of this stuff that is also ephemeral, like the production notes and things like that, exist still, so that you're able to reference it, or like reviews from, magazines at the time, like the paper things we don't think about surviving.
No. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The issue is with film is that the way it was done back then, the film was volatile. So some of it could just be easily destroyed. It also, in the early days, they didn't think about archiving this stuff. It was just like when movies weren't thought of as something important or culturally valuable. These things just got thrown in the back of drawers and closets and whatnot. So you don't really, they didn't think about archiving these things. And of course you had the volatility of the chemicals too. So a lot of them got destroyed. There are some still, and now they're preserving them, which is wonderful because now we understand how important it is. And for a long time, even in academia, silent films were not really considered valuable to look at even. I think that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years where people are now saying, wait a minute, we've got to really look at these silent films. So that's one of the reasons why you don't have a whole lot of the films. But of course, magazines and journals have been around forever. So they were easily packed and stacked and then easily scanned when we started doing internet stuff. So you get a lot of the journals still around. Like you said, that was easily put onto microfiche and microfilm and preserved because we were already preserving journals and magazines. That was considered, but films were a little bit different, and it took a while before they started doing it. And that's unfortunate, but there are some, and they're finding them every year. More and more silent films are found in some warehouse somewhere. And that's, again, thank you to the archivists for that.
Yes. Well, I also think people find reels in their attics, and I was reading something the other day about like some of the lost episodes of like Doctor Who, even in the UK, that they found. Yep. Somebody had recorded them somehow on early, recording equipment. It's just,
it's the way it works. The way it worked back then is that there were prints made. There were film prints made of the original when you had the master film. Prints were made and sent to the theaters. So each theater had its own reel of the film. So they could be anywhere. That these things could be found in old theater closets that haven't been used in forever. I mean, they could be found anywhere. So I hope that we keep finding and discovering some of this old material.
Did you have, I know the shows that you talk about, like the television shows you talk about, there are some early ones in there, but did you run into that with some, because I know like a lot of early television shows were either live or they didn't even tape them, or, they taped over them because again, it wasn't culturally important. Yeah. So we're like, oh no, we'll just use this and retape over or whatever.
Yes, that actually, there were a few of the live ones that I couldn't see. And the other issue with television shows is that you can't always, even if they did record them and there are copies, they're not necessarily available. If especially, and I'm trying to think of the names of a few of them. There was some of the, I'm actually going to open the book to tell you some of those that I could not see. But yeah, some of the early 1950s, let's see. I'm just looking here. I think it was the early Macbeth was alive, the 1954. Some of the adaptations of, what's the name of that? I'm thinking of the adaptations of Feathertop were live and in the 1950s. So that was really a problem in the 1950s. And then you wind up with television shows or movies that are just not you can't see them. I can't go to a theater to see them. I can't stream them unless all of a sudden they decide to start streaming them again. So you have that later into the 60s and 70s when we start to see some of the B films, especially in horror. Some of those are just not available, or I had to order a DVD, which, I mean, that DVDs are even old school at this point. So I had to order one movie from the 80s on a VHS tape. It was the only way, from some random online eBay maybe. So some of the more obscure stuff was also hard to get.
Yeah. I think we do have this idea that, you can see anything you want to now with all the streaming services, but there's still a lot out there that's not available anywhere.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And more recently, some of the very recent stuff that's indie, those are not easy to find too, because they aren't necessarily streamed on a service because they're indie films. Mm-hmm. And so those took a little bit of sometimes communication with filmmakers and stuff like that to get some of the indie works. But it did take a little doing sometimes to find some of this stuff. And in the case of those 50s TV shows, and then of course the early silent stuff, there was just no way.
Right. So you have dug through archives. You've watched a lot of television and movies. Your manuscript is ready to go. So what was your approach to actually publishing this book? Like, what was the path for you to do that?
Well, I working at Llewellyn was, gave me a sense of how they do their work and how great their production department is. And so I kind of just asked and say, hey, I got this manuscript. Are you interested? And so of course they went through their process and decided, yes, they would like to. So I was very excited about that because I do love Llewellyn. And I thought it was a good place for it. It's not a traditional book for that publishing company, but it's witches and witchcraft. And, that's still in their purview and they wanted it. So I was very happy to give my baby to them.
Was that, I imagine that was an interesting process, kind of like working inside the house while it was getting published. It was, I kept out of it. I am really good at compartmentalizing my work. So, I was not involved in the production of my book at all. I was strictly the author and I maintained my lane. And with that, and I worked on lots of other wonderful books while it was happening, and they did the same. And it turned out to be perfect. I've had nothing but good experiences with them. So that's good to hear.
Both in both ways, both capacities.
Yes, as an editor and as an author. Yeah.
Yes.
It's funny. I've talked to a lot of authors already in interviews for the podcast that basically have you to thank for their book getting published. And it's funny how often your name came up in conversations. Like, no, I had this conversation with Heather Greene, and she's like, "Have you considered writing a book?" And I was like, "Okay, so now I have you on the show." So, what do you look for? Because the thing that I heard from most people is that it's like, this topic and you're the person to write this book on. So, what are you looking for when you have those conversations with people?
Well, the person has to have a passion. It's not just about knowing the topic. I know how to cook dinner every night, but I have no interest in writing a cookbook. You have to have a passion for the topic. You have to be able to live with it for a year or two or longer, in my case, to want to write about it and to sit with it intimately, because sitting there writing is very much an intimate thing. It's about getting your thoughts onto page about a topic you have a passion for. So you got to look for somebody who has a real passion for the topic and has a unique viewpoint or a unique voice, because, there's a limited number of topics and you could have 10 books on the same subject, but the voices are totally different, and that's great. And we need that too. So a unique voice, an interesting angle, a passion for the topic, and then someone who has writing ability, so can you actually write? not everybody wants to, not everybody can, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a number of things. That I look for.
So in your current, I guess, writing life, what does that look like for you? Like, how do you balance your own writing with editing work? And it seems like they both could take up all of your time, either one. So how do you balance that life, I guess?
Very carefully. Most of the time I am mostly editing right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's my main portion of my workday. The writing I'm doing now, I'm not working on a book, which is a totally different animal. Right now, the writing I'm doing is for as a freelance religion journalist. So those kind of things, that kind of work I can do in between. I can write at night. I can write when I'm taking a lunch. I can sort of do that. A book is a different thing because it takes a lot more out of you for the capacity is you're talking about, 100,000 words versus researching and writing 1,000-word articles. So the writing is less right now. And it is a balance though. Some days I work longer than 8-hour day. That's just the way it is. Yeah. Sometimes I write on the weekends. I'm not doing any pleasure writing. I'm not doing anything like that. So I value my downtime as well.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I do think you mentioned this earlier about being, specifically a nonfiction author. And I do think there's so much overlap between all kinds of writing, but there is kind of, maybe it is compartmentalization, like you said. Like it's just sometimes a little easier to step away from that, I think, and take your downtime than when you're working on like a creative piece, because they don't let you alone sometimes.
Right. Well, when you're writing a news article, there's a starting point and a stopping point, and it's a short period of time. It has to be done by the deadline. And sometimes I've done articles that literally I get assigned it at noon on a Thursday, and it's due noon the next day, and it's 24 hours. And it's these quick things, and I love writing that in that capacity. Mm-hmm. And it blends really well with doing other projects as a freelancer, because that's how I manage my time. When you're doing something that's more creative, whether it's a fiction book or a long work of nonfiction, like you said, there's the endpoint. You got to set those endpoints, those soft endpoints, so that you don't drive yourself crazy and you aren't in front of your computer for 24 hours straight. Mm-hmm. You've got to walk away and give your brain break. You got to give your brain a break and let things flow to come back and do it again. So when you have news articles that are short, or when I'm editing a specific portion of a book, it's natural hard breaks. Whereas when you're doing like my book, those were soft breaks. I could go back to it at any point, but I needed to keep myself from doing it. And that's an important part of the process, I think, to keep yourself sane too. Mm-hmm.
I would imagine too, with that much research for the type of book, I mean, for this book specifically, like you could have probably spent more years even researching before you got to writing the manuscript. So you kind of have to sift yourself, like, this is where my research has to stop. I have to write.
Absolutely. Yeah. I could have gone down so many more rabbit holes. I could have looked at, I added other films to it. But I set some parameters right at the beginning. And that's why I did that, to say, these are the parameters. I'm making judgment calls, and I literally can't, because the book would have been triple the size, and literally now it's huge. So, you have to set those parameters. And I could have kept going, because witch movies are not over. It's, the end point was the end point, because that's when I was done. I could, 20 years, I'll be able to do volume 2.
Yes. And I will look forward to it. I will look forward to that. So what, I mean, I will say volume 2 project is a little ways out, but so what other goals do you have for your writing now? Like, is there something else on the horizon that you're looking at that you want to work on, or?
I'm doing some research for potentially writing another similar book, but that's way far out because I just we were just talking, like you pointed out, is balancing your time.
Mm-hmm.
So I know what it's going to take, and I'm not sure I'm ready. I have children. So I have to balance my time, and they come before anything.
Yeah.
So that's sort of sitting on the burner right now as a potential. And I also am continuing writing wise to work as a religion journalist and doing. I love that work. I tend to focus on paganism and witchcraft and occult practices. Big surprise. So I love to do that, and I'll continue to do that and I can post my articles up on my website so people can look at them, and that's important work. Doing religion journalism and focusing on paganism and the many different religions that fall under that category, that's important work. So right now, that's my focus.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you. It is important work. And I think having folks inside that world doing some of that journalism is even more important work.
I agree. And that was the whole premise of why the Wild Hunt began. Before I was there, that was the entire premise, that it was a news-based blog as it started out, and it eventually sort of evolved into a more news-styled journal, was having people who are in the community writing about it, because often these communities are written about from the outside and misrepresented, intentionally or not intentionally, most not intentionally, but yes. So I am enjoying that work. My articles are up on Religion News Service. They've picked up my articles, Religion Unplugged, as well. And I hope to keep, I had several articles picked up by AP and the Washington Post from Religion News Service. So it's really nice to see that work getting done. Like you said, it is important work, and I enjoy it.
Oh, well, I'm glad you're doing it, and I have enjoyed your articles too. So I appreciate that work. So I guess this is kind of a more frivolous question, but I was just curious, since you have gotten to, spend some real time with kind of the history of witches and pagans in, television and film, like, did you come away from that with like kind of either like a favorite representation or just straight up, this is my favorite work of witchy cinema or witchy television? And just having spent that much time with it, is it just like, oh, I enjoy it, period? Or did you really come away with like, no, these are the things I prefer as a viewer?
I think I always say The Wizard of Oz is my favorite movie. If people ask whether it's a witch movie or not, I always say that's my favorite movie. So I'm going to stick with that. And I do love the representation of witches in so many different capacities. The one thing that, and I never said this on any podcast or interview that anyone has ever, that I've had since the book came out. But I'll tell you is that before I wrote this book, I did not watch horror films. And I did not like them. I didn't watch them as a kid. They scared me. So going into writing this book, I knew I was going to have to engage in horror genre or engage with the horror genre. And I was a little bit nervous about it because I really wasn't a big fan of horror. Chiefly because I would have nightmares.
Yeah.
So I didn't want that. So, and I was particularly not interested in occult horror. That was one thing I stayed away from most of my life until I wrote this book. And since writing the book, I found a real appreciation for horror in all its ways. And now I actually love it. I will actually gravitate and watch horror willingly now. And I've seen, what do I want to say? The influence and importance of horror as a genre in our culture, and the book gave me an appreciation for that. So I think that is another good answer to your question. Is it's not specifically answering your question, but I think that's an interesting takeaway that I had from writing the book.
Yeah. No, that's an even better answer than I would have anticipated. A even more interesting answer, I guess. No, it's funny you say that because I, with the podcast, like I know there's a lot of really interesting witch literature in the horror genre and books. And I too am not a huge horror person. Just I was when I was a kid, and then I had a kid, and suddenly I just couldn't do horror anymore. So reading it now I've kind of come back to it slowly, and it's been an interesting experience to come back to reading horror, specifically to talk to people about it on the podcast. And I'm like, oh yeah, I've been missing out, definitely, because there's really interesting things happening in that genre.
Yes, I also learned that I do yell at the screen at horror movies. That's another thing I learned about myself. See, all these things you can learn about yourself when you write. Mm-hmm. I yell at the screen during horror movies. Yes, I do.
Yeah. Like, please don't go in that. Why are you doing that?
Yeah, exactly. I'm full on yelling at the television or the movie screen.
So do you still have nightmares from horror?
I do. I wouldn't say they're nightmares. I had wacky dreams the entire time I was doing this book. Once I got into that period of time, because I would watch the movies for the period of time, and then I'd write the chapter. So when I got into the 70s and horror started, because there was no horror prior to that, very little anyway. Once I got into that and was just horror movie after horror movie after horror movie, I started having wacky dreams, all kinds of vampires and zombies. It didn't matter what movies I was watching. It was just these wacky dreams. And they weren't nightmares, just weird dreams. Yeah. So that was fun.
So of those like early 70s horror movies, specifically obviously about witchcraft or witches, like, is there one that really stands out to you?
Rosemary's Baby. Absolutely. I mean, there's most of the movies, the horror movies from that period of time are very cheesy, fun to watch. Absolutely. And I recommend people actually sample them. But the best made movie of that period of time is Rosemary's Baby. Carrie comes in second, and that's at the end. So it's a little different. But if we're looking at really the centerpiece of 1970s witch horror, Rosemary's Baby, without a doubt. Mm-hmm.
I had forgot. It's been a really long time since I've seen either of those. And Carrie, like, terrified me as a teenager. Mm-hmm. Like, that was one of the scariest movies I think I had seen at that point. And but Rosemary's Baby, I forgot that Ruth Gordon was in that movie until I was reading your book. And then I was just like, I can't believe that Maude was in Rosemary's Baby. How did I forget that?
Yeah, and she won an Academy Award for the performance.
Yeah, and it's incredible. And I was just like, I guess I so associate her with Harold and Maude. I had forgotten that she was in Rosemary's Baby, and just one of those kind of like Frisian moments when I was reading. No, that movie is pretty fantastic. Yeah, and I think though there are a lot of things around it, like the director, all those things that maybe have not aged well. I think the film itself has.
The film is brilliant piece of film art. It was done well right from the beginning. The style, the look of it is very, obviously from the era, but the movie is very watchable. It's still scary. It still evokes the creeping fear that you're supposed to have. It's really a great piece of art.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things I was thinking about in reading too, and you touch on this, but it's not really the focus of the book itself. But I guess, how did you, in doing your research and watching these films and thinking about them for the book, did you kind of have that idea of like, these are the, I guess, the surges in interest in the occult and witchcraft and what that looks like in film and how that loop works? Because I always think of like, there's so many witches and pagans now who are, teenagers and young adults, like when The Craft came out, that are like, oh, I'm a craft witch, because that's when I really discovered it. So there's like this feedback loop of like representations of witches in popular, culture in television and film. And then there's also like a resurgence in interest in those practices. So what are your thoughts on that, I guess?
Yeah, no, and I do talk about it's actually that's a major part of the last half of the book.
The part that I didn't get to.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a major feature because it's which comes first. In the case of the 1970s, which is the first wave, it was a combination of cultural movements and societal change that brought not only the witchcraft movement, the modern witchcraft movement, to the forefront and became visible for Hollywood directors who now all of a sudden were freed from censorship. So they were able to do the horror films. So there sort of was a commingling of stuff going on because of the social movements of the period of time. And then 1996 was no different. We have our second wave of witchcraft films. They were not popular. They didn't become popular because of an interest in practicing the cult. They became popular because of the satanic panic. But an offshoot or what happened was it transitioned. It flipped almost 360, or I'm sorry, 180. And you had the craft. And so now you had all these people who were interested in practicing the cult on the flip side. It was a very interesting period of time where you went from intense fear of the occult and backlash to this embracing of it by the end of the 90s. So it's a very interesting wave right there. And then the next wave is the one we're at the end of right now. And I'm beginning to think we might be over it. I think it might have ended, but that began around 2011. And again, in conjunction with changes in our society and upheaval and instability in our culture that's happened over the past 10 years that we've seen. So, and concern and worry. So people are turning to the occult, to mysticism, to New Age practices, to religion, to, and of course, with that comes an interest in witchcraft, which of course influences Hollywood's products. And so there's a correlation, most certainly, with those. And I get into it in the book.
Yeah. I apologize for misspeaking on that. I will caught for listeners. I talked to Heather before we started talking and I got the book kind of late, so I had to skim the last half. But I appreciate you pointing that out. Thank you for the correction. I think, and one part I do remember from the second part is that one of the interesting things that I think about the current like Hollywood witch is so much of it was reboots. Like you pointed out, it's like nostalgia comfort fare in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that happens. And there's a lot of different cultural genres and pieces of cultural products that do that. We saw a lot of cultural products doing reboots of 50s style or using 50s style stuff in the 80s. So there's an appeal going to people that generally are in their 30s and 40s. And I think a lot of the reboot stuff that we're seeing witchcraft wise is really appealing to the 90s witches that you mentioned. So I think there's a correlation there where we see that. But it's interesting because not only is it doing that, but it's also tapping into a new youth movement that is engaging with occult practices. There's been a rise in tarot reading. There's been a rise in astrology and interest in witchcraft, renewed just as it was in the 90s. So I think the reboots are appealing not only to people who were 90s witches and who started out then, like you were talking about, but also, young people who are just starting out too. So you've got a double audience there. That's fantastic.
So why do you think we're at the end of the current wave, out of curiosity?
Well, I'm not seeing quite as many witch films and witch related fare coming out of mainstream Hollywood as I did in the earlier period of time. So that's one, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but looking at the past two waves, they only last about 10 years. So we're at 10 years.
Yeah.
So the first one was about 1968 to 1978, 1979. And then the second one was about 1988, 1987 to 1999. 1990. So it's usually about 10 or 12 years. Mm-hmm. So this one, I believe, started around 2011, maybe a little earlier, but 2011 roughly. And we're now more than 10 years after that.
Yeah,
so
no, that makes sense. I think it still seems very prevalent in publishing, like especially in fiction, especially like romance. Seems very like witch heavy right now. Mm-hmm. And I do wonder if it's kind of tapering there too, but it's definitely very popular in the genre as part of that kind of paranormal romance.
I don't know.
Trend.
Yeah, I don't study it. So I don't study novels in that area. So I don't know, but I'm only talking about what I'm observing from film and television.
No. Yeah.
And the important thing is to know when I say waves, witches don't completely go away. It's just they don't. I mean, Harry Potter was most popular out of a witch wave, for example. And, after the last witch wave in the 90s, it moved into paranormal. And the important thing is there still were witch movies, but of course, there's always tricklers. There's always these little ones that kind of they would fit into that genre. You have a few of those. We had, Twitches was not done in a witch wave, for example. But the focus of Harry Potter, the focus of Twitches, the focus of paranormal witchcraft, paranormal shows that have witches in them, or the high fantasy that was popular, like Lord of the Rings and whatever, during the 2000s. All of these were popular during the 2000s. The focus those weren't witchcraft films. They weren't the centerpiece. Witches weren't the driving factor necessarily. Fantasy was it, the witch world, a magical world, fantasy, or in the case of paranormal, it was more ghosts and paranormal than it was a witchcraft film. So, and I talk about the distinctions of this within the book, but there's a little bit of a difference there. Whereas, you get into the 2010s and you have American Horror Story Coven. That is centerpiece is witchcraft and working with witchcraft. Salem, again, witchcraft. So you have that difference, and that's what makes a witch wave versus a witch movies from a non-witch wave.
Yeah. No, I think that distinction is important. It would be interesting. Now I'm kind of curious to have to find someone who's doing what you're doing, but looking at literature and where those intersect. Like, I want to see how those waves interplay with each other, because I think it exists in the literature world too. And I'm just curious if it's like, the in-between wave is the literature wave and then it's film or something.
I don't know. And there's so many more books than I would think that there's so many more books being published than there are movies being created. So I would have no idea. I mean, the Harry Potter book was written during the witch wave. Mm-hmm. Of course, it was in the UK. So, that might look a little different over there because she wasn't here, but she may have been inspired to write something about witchcraft because there was a major, satanic panic was happening in the UK. So maybe that influenced her in the imagination of her story. Mm-hmm. So it would be an interesting look just to kind of see how that works out.
Yeah. I can't imagine that research, though. You're right. There's so many more books getting published.
I'm just guessing. Although now with YouTube and TikTok, I'm not so sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many layers to things. I think about now, like how, for people who do go do a PhD, like you have just so many ways, so many rabbit holes you can go down for your dissertation. There's a lot out there right now.
Oh, absolutely.
So I guess big thing, kind of ask you what projects are on the horizon, and we've talked about that. I guess one of the things I wanted to specifically ask you about the book is like, what do you hope people take away from Lights, Camera, Witchcraft? Like, what do you hope your reader walks away from with this book?
I hope that the reader walks away with a newfound appreciation for the witch as a figure, that she's more than just a fantasy character, that she is complex. She represents a number of different things within our society. So that's the sort of the broader, big, deep takeaway, is that the witch is an important American cultural symbol, and that she has immense value in us understanding a lot of aspects of our culture. And that would be particularly related to gender, religion, and other things as well. I also, the other takeaway, I think I would like people to enjoy themselves. I would like people to look back at old films and see and appreciate film artistry. And whether it's a horror film or a silent film or a drama or whatever, I would like people to watch more movies. So that's sort of the secondary fun takeaway as well.
I can tell you that I added a lot of stuff to my playlist for streaming after reading the book. So, I can give you one person who has definitely taken that. I have never seen I Married a Witch. And so like now I have to go track this movie down and watch it. So
that one's easy to get. You'll be able to find that on a streaming service.
Yeah, I found that one pretty fast.
Yeah.
And a long time ago, like I'm 50. And so like early in my life, I had very long hair, and I had a boss who told me I looked like Veronica Lake. I did not. I do not look like Veronica Lake. I just want to make that very clear. But I had long hair and my name was Victoria. So I think he just kept calling me Veronica by mistake and was trying to cover for it. But I've always found that kind of amusing. I was like, how have I never seen this movie?
It's a fun one. It's definitely the that comedy of that period of time. So you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I love screwball comedies too. So I'm really, but I like that you refer to it as a proto screwball comedy. And I was like, okay, yeah, I've got to go watch this. Is there a good way for folks to who want to read your articles, or other ways for people to find you online, out in the world, all that good stuff?
Yeah, my website is heathergreene.net. And you can find my articles are all linked down there, as well as my socials. I am most active on Twitter, and that's at MiraSelena01. Of course, you can get that from my website as well. I do have a Facebook page and an Instagram page and all the things. So you could reach out through those, through my website, of course, through the contact. And you can find my book at, all the major resellers, as well as directly at Llewellyn.com. And today is March 30th. So today and tomorrow, they did a discount for the book, but they will probably do that again. But you can get the book from Llewellyn.com.
Great. And this will probably go out. People will miss the discount, but
you can cut that.
Okay. But I will make sure all those contacts are in the show notes so people can reach you. So I sent you the question list. So I wanted, so that we have a tiny game of chance at the end of the podcast. So I always joke that, being a Scorpio, I'm just nosy and I want to talk about things that aren't small talk with people. So I will roll a die, and depending on what number I get, I'll ask you a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. We've kind of covered a lot of these already, but we might get a different take, and it will be tangential to writing or your book. I try not to just ask people random questions. So I'm going to roll. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which of those topics you would like. 4. Ooh, politics. We touched on this a little bit with satanic panic stuff. So with the continued popularity of witches and witchcraft in pop culture, and the normalization that I think occurs with those representations, like if people just get used to the idea that real witches are a real thing. Do you see witches or out witches or witchcraft practitioners having more prominent roles in public life, like politics, community, community facing things?
I think that, modern witches, pagans, and all of those adjacent religions, I think the people have always been involved in modern life, politics. We're talking politics here, or similar fields. I think they've always been very, very much so. But I think there has been an increase, from what I can tell, in the number of people who are out and open about their religion, which is, I think, the question you're asking. So in my viewpoint, from where I've been sitting since 2009, or since I've been doing the work for the pagan community, media work, I have definitely seen an increased number of people who are more willing to put themselves out there in their jobs and be very open about their practices and their religious beliefs. And yes, there has been a number of people that have run for office that I have seen, if we're talking politics, that will actually be, I'm sorry, that little song is my phone. I'm going to turn that off. So I am going to, hold on, let's see, where were we? So I have seen a number of people who have been running for office. There have been several that have actually succeeded and have served. There's also been more people out publicly as pagan in some capacity in the military. We've seen that, and we've also had a lot of cases in the last 20 years that have been religious freedom related, where pagans have won, because since the 80s, more and more people are aware that paganism in its various modes is actually a religion. So yes, I think that there are more people have been out and open and been able to and been free from fear.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that representation of witchcraft in popular media is part of that acceptance?
Absolutely. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, is that in the 1996, when the craft came out, shortly before that, there was the language around modern witchcraft was starting to change. And there was this sort of binary division between what was witchcraft bad and what was witchcraft good. And the word they started using for witchcraft good was Wicca. So then you had in popular representations, popular cultural representations, you had this binary set that went witchcraft and Wicca. Witchcraft is what you were seeing in the Satanic Panic. Wicca was this nature-based religion with people that were peaceful and religious. So you had that binary set, and the craft was part of that. X-Files is another example where you'd see it. And then you saw it happening throughout the movies and television shows through the 90s. And then into the 2000s, you have an increasing number of law and police type dramas that were making that distinction very clear. And police and law dramas often in our cultural mindset set the rules of what is right and wrong. I mean, we're talking about fiction texts here, but they do that. They set themselves up to say, well, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, this is the law, this is not the law, et cetera. That's what they do. That's how they work. So they were doing this. They were saying Wicca versus was good and witchcraft was bad. And this was happening repeatedly through the 2000s. As changes were being made in our culture. So yes, absolutely, culture, the representations of witchcraft contributed to that change and contributed to the ability of people to come out and be witches and Wiccans more publicly. Yes.
I think it's always interesting that how those things play against each other, and that like the part of your book that I found incredibly interesting, and it's just a topic of interest in general, is that kind of reaction of pagans and witches to satanic panic and how that was navigated. And I think now we're kind of seeing this divergence again between, like, you can be a Wiccan or you can be into a witch who's into witchcraft, and those are both good things. Like it seems like there's less couching of like, this is the kind of magic I practice. And oh, by the way, it's okay because it's the safe kind. It seems like people are a little more, at least within the community. I don't know if that's as true outside the community. I think in the community, there's a broader conversation, like all of the, I don't have to say I'm a safe witch or, like I think that conversation has just changed, especially in the last few years. But it's just an interesting topic in general. And I think, like you said, the media and all of those things, just, current events, all of that plays into that mishmash. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in more recent years, that binary of Wicca versus witchcraft, like you said, is changing too, where it's dividing up into other types of magical practices. And all of those are good too. Potentially good. So it's the redefining of our relationship to magic and what magic means and how it's practiced and who practices it. This has been diversifying for the last 10 years. So that's the binary happened in the 90s. That was the first step. The next step was what we're seeing more recently. And that's fantastic.
Yeah. And I mean, good for publishing industry. Like you said, we need many voices on, the range of topics that we have to talk about. So I think, it is definitely a good thing and an evolution that I think will continue. The umbrella just gets bigger and bigger, right?
Absolutely. And it's so refreshing actually, because the modern witchcraft community is that diverse. So the more that we see that in representation, even if it's hokey, the more it gets closer to being beneficial to the community itself in practice. These discussions become a little bit more intricate and provide context and nuance. And that's important. Even if the representations aren't real or perfect, it still creates that nuance, those layers that as a culture we can sort through. So yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah. Oh, me too. Heather, thank you so much. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for writing this incredible book and for sharing some of your insight, both as an author, and an editor. I just really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. I loved being here. It was a great conversation.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Bolt Press and is edited by Keifel Agostini, who also designed our logo. Our music is Voices, composed for us by Alexander Shanekar. You can support our work, get early access to episodes, ask your own death, sex, religion, politics, money question, and get some free stuff by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/witchlitpod. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at witchlitpod. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other witches find the show. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.